So welcome everybody to our first speaker series of 2024. It's great to see you guys. This is our, I think, third year doing the speaker series, and so it's really fantastic to have all of you with us here today. So before we get started with Morgan's presentation, we're going to go through a quick snippet of like when and what our programs are, what we've been up to, and what sort of events we have coming up in the spring here. But before we do that, we got to do the boring bits. We got to do all the housekeeping pieces. So you guys might have noticed we have a camera setup over here as well as a microphone setup on this computer. So this speaker series is being held both live in person here as well as virtually over Zoom. And we are recording it so that we can put it up on our YouTube later on, so you can come back and watch it as many times as you'd like to. You can also see all of our past speaker series as well. So you can hear all about some of our past data, some information from LAD, the water compact from the CSKT. We have a nice variety of topics over the last several years, and you're more than welcome to check those guys out. So housekeeping from the room here, make sure that at some point you sign in over here just to get a tally of like how many people were at each speaker series. You saw bathrooms are down the hall and out. If you need to get up, if you need to go get a piece of candy, drink of water, use the bathroom, feel free at any point here. We ask you to hold questions to the end. We'll be doing a Q&A after the presentation is wrapped up. And for the people on Zoom, we figured out where to put this podium, and now I'm realizing it's the worst spot for the podium ever, so bear with me on this one. So for the folks on Zoom, if you'd prefer to remain anonymous, please change your name to guest and turn your video off. But in theory, when the recording gets posted, you won't actually have your face on anything. And for the folks in the room, the camera literally goes like this. So you will also not be in the recording unless you stand behind here and just kind of lurk as we're presenting. So yeah, you're solid. So fantastic. So we're going to get into a little brief WEN introduction here, just in case you weren't familiar with what the Watershed Education Network is and what we do. So my name is Steffi Novak. I'm the Stream Team Coordinator here at WEN. And around the room we have several other WEN folks. So if you could give a wave when I say your name. We have Kyle Wonders. We have Riley Comstock. I think that's your last name. It's been bugging me all day. We have Deb Fosnot, Anna Picard. We have a couple of our new interns floating around. I think Anna is technically one of our new interns. Oliver over here. Yeah, we have a nice variety of WEN folks in the room here, and you fantastic other folks, and other like volunteers and everybody, so it's great to have you. So, I'm hoping that you're all here to hear Morgan Valliant talk about the history of the Rattlesnake dams and get some project updates on the removal of the McKinley Dam. If not, you're in the wrong room. But I'm recognizing a lot of faces, so it looks like we're good. So we're going to get into this little WEN intro. So in case you weren't familiar, WEN is a nonprofit here in Missoula whose mission is to foster knowledge, awareness, and appreciation of watershed health through citizen science, youth and school engagement, and outreach to our communities in order to grow future stewards. So the way we go about this is through a nice variety of programs. So a lot of you are probably familiar with our largest adult program, which is Stream Team. So Stream Team goes out every single weekend in the fall to collect data on Rattlesnake Creek and Grant Creek. So we follow a nice citizen science approach, taking people of all backgrounds in science or no science at all ages, all abilities, and we take them out into the field and we show them what healthy creeks look like and how we go about monitoring them for baseline data and keeping an eye on what sort of impacts are happening in those creeks and with the restoration projects that might be ongoing. So to kind of complement our adult set of programs, we have our youth and school programs, which take all of the things that we do with our adults and work it to a K-12 audience. So we can take students out on field trips or go into their classrooms and teach them about things like river ecology and groundwater and other topics and just get them kind of involved and interested in science in a more hands-on way than they might experience with their regular teachers. And to kind of bridge the gap between the two, we have our backcountry stream corps. So this is one of my favorite programs. It's coming up this summer again. This will be our 4th year running this program. That's a real big 4th year. That's going to be really awesome. We take 6 high school students out into either the Rattlesnake or Grant Creek, and they get to do large woody debris surveys, looking at in-stream wood, and doing some of our stream team sampling, looking at single points, and kind of working through different protocols at those points. And we take these students out that have pretty much no background in any sort of hands-on field science, and we can train them in protocols and collect really valuable data. And they also get to hear from a lot of different guest speakers who'll tell them about different aspects about either of the creeks they were in. So if you know any high school students, we'll have our application up on our website. Feel free to just pass it along. We'll be poking into schools, putting flyers, posters, things like that up. So keep an eye out, and we'll definitely be sharing what sort of results we see and what sort of information we gather as that program goes on. So this year, we also are really excited to be continuing our Backyard Citizen Science program. So this might be kind of a new program to some of you guys. This is one that we've been slowly rolling out, and we finally got into a really solid position. We take these citizen science kits, like on this photo here, and we can give these kits to families, groups, teams, schools, whoever would like to go out and do citizen science in their backyard. So we give them the gear, we give them an instruction booklet, and they get walked through how to do the protocols for the first several times with WEN staff members. And after that, they're just able to take their kit and their kiddos and go to the creek and just collect data and just kind of explore what their backyard streams look like. So one of our other adult programs that we're actually going to have coming up, hopefully not too soon, is our groundwater monitoring. So groundwater monitoring is in Greeno Park in the Rattlesnake. There's a system of 15 groundwater wells in the park, and we take adult and kind of older teen volunteers out every month to monitor groundwater in the park. Now, it's a little tricky to do that in the winter, because as you might imagine, these wells are all flush to the ground and covered in snow right now, and ice and melted water, and it's really cold and kind of hard to get to them. And so hopefully we don't go out there for a couple months, because that'll mean we'll have a nice solid winter. But pretty soon we'll be going back out, and we'll run groundwater sampling all through the fall until we get snow again in November. And so finally, we have our winter speaker series, which you'll almost be kind of familiar with because you have joined us here. So this is our 3rd year hosting the speaker series, and we have some really great upcoming speakers, including our one tonight here. We're also going to be hearing about some information on Paddy Creek, the Smurfett Stone Mill site, as well, which is a panel discussion, as well as some of our WEN data and what we've been seeing in the Rattlesnake and Grant Creek. So this is kind of an overview of what those events, what dates they're at. If anything sounds interesting to you guys, feel free to reach out, email us, go on our website, give us a call. We'd love to have you out on any of our outings. We're also looking for folks to do in-office sort of things like data entry and analysis, some of our youth and school programs, as well as coming to any of our speaker series. We're also helping out at the Trout Unlimited Banquet, which is next month, if anybody's interested in either volunteering for that or going to it. It's going to be a really fun time, February 24th. So, little shameless plug here. Next speaker series, Carver, do you want to give a wave? Is going to be Carver here, talking about the history of Paddy Creek, so creek to ditch and back again. Carver's a geography graduate student here and is going to be talking to us about his work in Paddy Creek. So you've heard me kind of rattle on for a little bit here, but the person you really came here to actually hear about is Morgan Valliant. So I'm going to introduce Morgan, and then we're going to have him up here. So Morgan is the Associate Director of the Ecosystem Services Division of Missoula Parks and Rec. He's been working for over 20 years to improve habitats in western Montana. Years spent overseeing ecological research projects for the University of Montana, and working for Missoula County to organize landowner groups around multi-jurisdictional land management plans. In his current role, he focuses his efforts on the development of large, collaborative environmental and outdoor recreation projects. Since 2017, he's been involved with the efforts to decommission Missoula's original drinking water system. He's been very involved with the removal of the lower intake dam and reservoir on Rattlesnake Creek in 2020, and is currently on the team assessing options for the other 10 dams in the Rattlesnake Wilderness. His presentation today is going to highlight the history of Missoula's first drinking water system, the 2020 Rattlesnake Dam and Reservoir Restoration Project, and the current effort to remove a dam on McKinley Lake in the Rattlesnake Wilderness. So I'd like you all to help me welcome Morgan to our speaker series.
So one thing, thanks for coming, and Carver, I want you to know that it is a requirement that you wear the same shirt as Steffi when you come on the 27th. So
Absolutely.
Please coordinate.
It's a great shirt.
It's a great shirt. Yeah, great minds. Well, yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction, Steffi. I'm gonna roll through. Hopefully, I've tried to populate a lot of good pictures into this presentation rather than just bulleted text, but you'll be able to see a little bit of both. As Steffi mentioned, my background is really in restoration ecology. I got my undergraduate here at the University of Montana with a degree in biology and then a master's in plant community ecology at Washington State University. And after having several different jobs in the Valley, my longest stint has been with the city of Missoula. And so I was our conservation lands manager for a dozen years. And then and I'm going to actually just, hopefully this thing's on the so I'm going to move it a little bit. And then recently with the creation of the Ecosystem Services Division, which is fairly new within the city, I've been really working on a lot more larger collaborative projects. And the projects that I'm going to talk about today really are collaborations both within the city, between multiple departments, and then also with nonprofits, federal and state agencies. And then the Watershed Education Network has been there with us all along too, especially as we've done work in Rattlesnake Creek. This is a picture of one of the lakes that the city owns, and when I say the city, it's you all. In 2017, our community purchased our drinking water supply, and it came with our original drinking water supply. This was absolutely huge for our community, and a lot of people really thought about what value it would have to have, pipes in the ground that don't leak and water faucets that give good drinking water. And that is certainly very important. But there was also significant lands and other infrastructure that came with that acquisition. And a lot of my work since 2017 has been to help figure out what to do with the rest of this infrastructure. This is Glacier Lake up in the Rattlesnake Wilderness. And you can just see, and you'll see several lake photos, but you can kind of see the impounded dam. Oh, there we go, right there. That line right there is the impoundment on the lake. And so why do we have dams in the Rattlesnake Wilderness? So when we look back at the history of basically the colonization of Missoula Valley, it really tapping into Rattlesnake Creek really started by Warden and Higgins. In 1871, they dug a ditch to bring water from Rattlesnake Creek to pretty much downtown Missoula to their mill. And Missoula Mills was one of the first buildings in downtown Missoula. Remnants of this ditch are still all throughout the Rattlesnake. You can still find this on our public lands and trails along the creek. And then really quickly thereafter, as the population grew, they also recognized that this water could supply our drinking water needs, not just run a mill. And so they started constructing a system of roads and trails further up into the headwaters of Rattlesnake Creek to then impound natural lakes up there. And between 1911 and 1921, and at this point it wasn't Warden and Higgins, it was Missoula Waterworks and Milling, or Missoula Water Works at that point. They'd split from the milling company, built 10 dams on 8 lakes up in the wilderness. And that impounded, surprisingly, 820 million gallons of water every year. And this is original drawing from the, I think this was 1920 sketch of the way the water system worked. And you can see kind of up there, the very top, those little lakes on two different creeks, Wrangell and Lake Creek, that combine to Rattlesnake Creek, that flow to a lower intake dam, which we removed in 2020, that then went into a 30-inch wooden water pipe that brought it all the way down into the heart of town. And that's the way Missoula got its water up until 1983, really. And in the 80s, at that point, there had already been a lot of wells drilled. There was an outbreak of Giardia within our community, and the water company at the time decided, let's invest in groundwater rather than surface water. They basically quit using this water system for drinking water. It was at that time recognized that it would be our community's emergency water supply. If something happened and we needed to turn on that tap, we could pull surface water from Rattlesnake Creek. Everyone would have been under a boil order because that water would not have been treated at that time. But yeah, that's basically how the system worked. And so in the winter, up in the headwaters, you capture your snowmelt, and then throughout the year, as the lower intake dam started to drain, somebody on a mule would roll 25 miles up into the Rattlesnake Wilderness and turn a gate valve and put more water in the creek. And a day later, that water would arrive down at the Rattlesnake Dam site. So, and this map is actually a heck of a lot easier to read than the last map. One of the things that changed at that same time in the 1980s was the designation of the Rattlesnake Wilderness. And so in I think it was 81 actually, I got the date in here, but the Rattlesnake Wilderness was designated. And so that's the kind of green dotted line that you see on the map on the right there. And you can see in general the lower intake dam and reservoir was right here. And then you've got, I'd say probably 18 miles of Rattlesnake Creek up to where Wrangell and Lake Creek come together. And then those 8 individual lakes with impoundments on them. And so when the wilderness area was created, the folks that drafted that designation recognized that the city had really key infrastructure in the wilderness, and actually wrote into the wilderness designation certain rights to allow, at that time, the water company that owned it to go up and maintain this drinking water system and repair these dams. In 2017, the city acquired Mountain Water, and that really started public ownership of this water utility. And it also kind of changed our philosophy for managing this water utility. And in the past, when it really was managed as a utility for profit, now because it is publicly owned by the citizens of Missoula, we operate this not just for delivery of service, but through that lens and making sure that everything we're doing is benefiting Missoula residents and keeping things local. In addition to all the utility infrastructure that we got, the pipes in the streets and all the trucks that came with it and all the tools, there was also this original water system, the water rights that came with it, about 200-ish acres of land, some of which are now parks, which is another benefit of the acquisition. And then all these associated water rights are valuable to the city, make sure stays in our valley rather than getting abandoned and transferred to a downstream user. And so a lot of the work we're doing, and please don't ask a ton of questions about it because this is not my background, but we've got lawyers working on this to make sure that we can retain those water rights in one way or another, even if it's just for in-stream flow. And as we often do, as we've pushed this project forward, we again have a ton of collaboration with a lot of different goals in mind. So on the right, you'll see a picture of the lower intake dam. That is where, and actually this picture really illustrates it well. You got Rattlesnake Creek coming out of the bottom of the dam, flowing into the top, into a 3 million gallon reservoir. The original dam was here and impounded all of this, and then it was later turned into concrete, and then the larger reservoir was built. And then if you follow Rattlesnake Creek all the way up, just kind of where it turns and hooks kind of all the way up there at the very top is where those upper lakes are located. So in 2017, very shortly after acquisition of the water utility, we started talking with the Forest Service about what we should do with these dams in the wilderness and the lower intake dam. Lower intake dam is not on Forest Service property, but they have property on either side. One of the things that we realized really quickly as a city was that this water supply, it was not an effective emergency water supply. The infrastructure was no longer there to actually put water from this facility into a pipe to get it into somebody's house. And so we quickly realized that we needed to figure out a different plan for this system of dams throughout this drainage. And in 2018, and this study is available online as well. I'll have some links at the end of the presentation, but the city completed a feasibility study that really analyzed cost benefit of increasing storage versus rehab versus decommissioning all these different dams, and whether or not it was even worth trying to keep this as an emergency water system. We started a partnership that same year with Trout Unlimited and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. These were already strong partners that were present at the lower intake dam doing a bunch of work and trying to deal with fish passage issues. This dam, this lower intake dam, really did mark the end of the bull trout run on Rattlesnake Creek. This was a major barrier and something that fisheries folks have been working on for a long time to try to alleviate. In 2019, we hosted an open house, glorious 2019. Everybody was still hanging out, and we had like 150 people come to the open house. It was colossally successful, and really started to just kind of set some overall project goals for how we were going to address this failing infrastructure within this system. And then we decided to really start with the low-hanging fruit first and tackle the lower intake dam. And in 2020, what was crazy is in 2018, we got permission to pull the dam and restore it. Everybody was like, great, we'll see in 6-8 years. We were able to get all the money together and actually pull the dam within 2 years. And so it was one thing that was super unique about this project, which I'm really proud about, is 80% of the project cost was all private donations, grants, or some kind of outside funds. It was not taxpayer dollars or ratepayer dollars. And so it was a really good example of what you can do with a strong public-private partnership. And I've got some pictures of that project as well. But and then really on the heels of removing this dam, we were already having discussions, but really started to think really critically about what to do with these other 10 dams on 8 lakes, 25 miles from, on 25 miles of dirt road and trail from where we are today, essentially. It really took strong partnerships with the Forest Service to get that project moving forward. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that project and that relationship as we move forward, because that's really where we are right now. So some of the issues that we were dealing with is all of this infrastructure was aging. There was really not a lot of reinvestment in our community from Mountain Water into this infrastructure. Most of that money was going to shareholders out of state. And so it was failing. And I was really struck as I started to work with a lot of the staff that had been managing these dams. A lot of them came over and are still city employees right now. One of them who had been managing these dams for 20 years said, Morgan, this lower intake dam, we're either going to take it out or nature's going to take it out. And that could happen any day. And lo and behold, this was 2018. I mean, this is pretty typical flows on Rattlesnake Creek, starting to overtop the head gates at the top of the structure, log jams piling up against the outflow that needed to be cleared. We were investing, I think it was somewhere around $30,000 to $40,000 a year in maintaining a site that really didn't meet any of our city goals. And so it was a real no-brainer to take it out. One of the reasons it had stayed for so long is because it was being used as a corporate retreat for the folks that owned the water company before the city purchased it. And they had this great log cabin there and mowed lawn, and it was like super cool place to hang out. And for those of you that have been up there now, and I know if you've been volunteering for WEN, you've gone up and seen this site multiple times. We've turned this 45-acre site into a restored habitat with public access and public land, and now anybody can go up there. And so in 2020, we did all this during a pandemic, which had its own challenges. We flipped the creek a couple times to move it and isolate it and tear out all the man-made infrastructure out of the floodplain. We salvaged a bunch of the historical elements here. And then rebuilt, I think it was about 1,200 linear feet of stream channel, several hundred feet of side channel, 4 acres of wetland, and replanted, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of plants, which if any of you guys help, thank you very much. They're doing great. And so a big project. It really did help, honestly, to have this project ending in fall and summer of 2020. Everybody, especially fall of 2020, was ready to get outside and do anything. And we were having volunteer events with like 200 people show up. And so it was pretty easy to get 50,000 plants in the ground. And this is a picture right after we were done. That 3 million gallon reservoir's gone. Right now, this is so green, it'd be hard to even see some of the structure, like we've had so much of the stuff fill in. But here's a lot of those side channels we created. Here's these little wetland pockets that we were able to create. I can't remember what her name was. Christine, oh gosh. Yeah, doing the groundwater. Was she working for TU? No. Anyway, I want to say it was Morris. Anyway, I'm sorry, but at the time when Trout Unlimited was working with us on this, they had been doing a bunch of work, and they still are doing a ton of work up in the 9 Mile, and had been doing some calculations on storage of water in wetlands. And what was really unique is, that reservoir that I showed earlier was a 3 million gallon reservoir, and at normal flows in Rattlesnake Creek, that would have filled up in, I don't know, 8 to 10 hours. What we've built here in these wetlands in this riparian area is actually storing more water than that reservoir was before. And so some of this data that's been coming out afterwards is just super cool. And I'm preaching to the choir, but this is why we do this type of work. So back to the wilderness. We finished removing that dam. That one cost a lot. There was a lot of infrastructure, a lot of heavy equipment. I will say that some of these dams will probably cost a little less to remove, but they're going to be so much more complicated, and so much more complicated mainly because they're 25 miles up into a wilderness area. You can't just drive there and work and then go grab lunch and come back and do some more work. And so the planning and logistics is really complicated. These 10 or 8 lakes with 10 dams in general, and I've got a map coming up after this that shows all the lakes in the wilderness, which is kind of fascinating. This place is just like a sponge, this basin. There's so many little lakes and potholes and wetlands. But McKinley Lake, Carter Lake, Warden Lake, Big Lake, Sheridan Lake, Little Lake, Glacier Lake, and Sanders Lake. So 3 lakes in the Wrangell Creek drainage, 4 lakes in the Lake Creek drainage. Some lakes have 2 dams on them, Sheridan and Sanders specifically. The way most of these work is McKinley drains down into Carter, Warden drains down into Carter, and so you could release Carter and then come up and do periodic releases into those. Big drains into Sheridan the same way. And so the system was this cascade of lake, feeding a creek, feeding that lower intake dam. and then going into a wooden pipe. All of these were lakes before they were impounded. And in general, those dams vary between 8 to 20 feet. It's all hand-stacked rock and earth dams. If you're way into acre feet and numbers, 2,585 acre feet of storage. There have been, all these lakes were fishless before introduction of fish, and so there has been an introduction of trout. Some of those have persisted. For instance, we don't believe there's any trout left in McKinley. I have seen them in Warden. I have not have seen them in Carter and Big, Sheridan, no. And so some of these populations are still there, some of them are not. When we look at water storage rights, I would say 70 almost are in Big Lake and Sanders Lake. Sanders Lake itself, and I've got a picture of it, is like 200 feet deep. It is a huge lake. Some of these others, like Warden, I mean, it's maybe 15, 20 feet deep when it's at its natural pool level. And so most of the water rights are associated with just two of the lakes that are up there. As I mentioned, the water company built the roads to get up to these lakes, built the trails to connect them, had all this work was done with horses and scrapes. There was literally just camps of people living up there for long periods of time. If you go and you recreate in this area or hike these trails, you will find old cabins and structures. I mean, there was a small city up here for they're definitely up here year-round building these dams by hand to get them to where they are today. And it's a real testament, I think, to the engineering and what is capable with persistence. And we've even gotten the old documents of, and I don't have them. I don't think I included the slides, but I think folks were getting paid $1 a day, $2 a day if you had a mule, and so you get paid a little bit more if you had an animal with you. So this was a colossal undertaking that took over a decade to complete. Access is coming from both directions. They were coming up Rattlesnake. They were also coming up over Grant Creek, the old Grant Creek Trail. We actually rediscovered some of it we had a fire one year and I had to hike in from the top of Point 6, and it's largely inaccessible up there, but you could see still old trail blazes and certainly mule trails. And so certainly materials were coming in from a bunch of different ways. So we are in the process still of trying to figure out what to do, but while we figure that out, we still have these obligations to maintain this infrastructure that is in the wilderness. And there is some uniqueness in these dams. About 5 of these dams are easement dams, and 5 are special use permit dams. And so easement dams, we have a lot more legal latitude to do work on them than special permit held by the Forest Service. And so there is some distinction, and to just make it even muddy the waters even more, like Sanders Lake has 2 dams. One is a special use and one is an easement dam. And so essentially the easement dams were there before the Forest Service owned the property surrounding them. So now this is a wilderness area. Here's that map I was telling you about. All those little things you see are actual named lakes in a relatively small wilderness area. The ones that you see in purple are the ones that are impounded and currently part that we're trying to figure out a plan for. What I've learned, and it was 1980, what I've learned as I've done this work is that the actual language of the designation of the Rattlesnake Wilderness is really unique. When you look at designation language for any other wilderness area, we have not found another one that actually states in the special provision language something as strong as this, which at the time of enactment of this act, the rights of the owner of the water right to customary and usual access, including necessary motorized use over and along existing roads and trails to any facilities used in connection therewith, and the right to operate and maintain those facilities. Really strong legal footing to access the wilderness to do this work in actual designation of the wilderness area. So what do we have to do up there? Missoula Water Cruise, and before that, Mountain Water Cruise, we're going up every year. Every year you have to go up as soon as the snow is starting to melt, and most of these lakes are up around 6,000 to 7,000 feet. They're usually iced over until early July. I think they usually end of June, early July. They'll do a helicopter flight to make sure none of the spillways are blocked with wood, and that could compromise the dam. And so removing that woody blockage, we've got monitoring, like this guy's doing perk tests on a piezometer that's driven into the dam. We have to remove all woody vegetation growing on the dam, so we have to give the dams haircuts essentially every few years. We also have management obligations. When I say we, this is the city, this is Missoulians, these are ratepayers. If you have a water bill, this is you. This is what part of your water bill is paying for right now. We also technically have to maintain the roads and the trails getting to those dams. So if you think about Franklin Bridge and some of those other bridges that use it out there, some of those bridges were replaced by Mountain Water Company back in the day. We do partner with the Forest Service on those, and so we have come to an agreement that, hey, we're going to try to deal with the dams. Can you please take care of the trails? And they've been great partners to work with. These things are continuing to deteriorate. A lot of the outlet structures no longer work or are not operable. We've been able to fix most of them in the open position, so at least the water will drain a little quicker. And then, of course, any work up there is quite expensive, whether it's coming in for annual inspections or doing flyovers with a helicopter, even driving up there. You know, if you were to drive, it takes, probably 2 hours to drive from the main trailhead to where you can park, and that's about an 18-mile drive, and then you have to hike another 2 to 5 miles depending on which lake you're going to actually access the lake. Almost all the work that we do up there is manual, except for assist with access, but we do occasionally use power tools as well. So here's what some of these look like. I'm going to be talking a lot about McKinley Lake. One of the reasons I put this picture in here is because I think it really does describe how all of these were built, very similar. And so, like, there's a dam right here with an outlet. Over there is a spillway. And so that spillway is at a lower elevation. You can see the natural lake line. Like, this is where the natural lake line is. That's the top of the dam. Water will fill up. And before it goes over the top of the dam, it'll run down that spillway. And that's pretty much how every dam is built. It's got to have that relief valve and that spillway to let off water. Big Lake, that's certainly one of the biggest. We actually, Mountain Water replaced the headgate structure, and so you can see pretty modern. This is how you get out and access the valve to open it up and drain the lake. Warden Lake, this is one that's frozen closed. It still has the original wooden structure in there for opening the valve. Carter Lake, that one's been permanently drawn down because the spillway failed back in the I think it was 96, the big snow year. So, and this is the prettiest one. This is Sanders Lake. This is the big one. It basically flows off. The outflow flows over just 1,000-foot straight vertical cliff. And it's just an absolutely phenomenal lake, and that lake is 200 feet deep at its deepest. It's also one of the hardest ones to get to. These goals that came up with the project really came about through our open houses and working with the public and then our partners. And this is really the lens through which we're making our decisions. And one of the first things is just in general, we've said these dams don't supply drinking water anymore. We need to quit spending maintenance dollars on them. We need to figure out a way to quit maintaining them, quit driving into the wilderness, quit flying into the wilderness, reduce that maintenance cost. We certainly have dam safety hazards that we have to comply with. And I think the highest rating one of these has is moderate. And so if they were to burst, you wouldn't really feel it in Rattlesnake Creek in the valley. I mean, it might come up a little bit on your boot if you're standing in the water. Certainly if you camped out below the lake, you'd probably drown. But in general, because the lakes are so far away from any habitable place, if a dam fails, it's not going to really do. The biggest thing it will do is a heck of a lot of natural resource damage and put a lot of sediment in the creek. But we do have those safety hazards to consider. Goal 3, and this is, I'm going to talk a lot about decommissioning, but we've also been exploring rehabilitation and whether or not rehabilitating any of these dams makes sense for our community moving forward. And so we are looking at public and environmental benefit, those management opportunities and water constraints. I'm not going to get way into this, but one of the things that we calculated with Sanders and Big Creek, and then we've been able to, and Big Lake, and we've been able to show it in proof of concept, is those 2 lakes have enough storage in them that if they were repaired and the valve was repaired, you could almost double the flows in Rattlesnake Creek in August and September. And so from a long-term climate resiliency standpoint, if we're getting hotter and drier, this could be the solution to keeping the fishery in Rattlesnake Creek going. But that is a huge decision that we need to make as a community, and we're certainly not willing to make it right now, but we are collecting that data. We have been doing proof of concept and have shown we can open Big Lake, which has an operational valve, and you get that pulse at the water gauge in Greeno Park almost 24 hours after. And so we've been tracking a lot of that. We've been tracking cold water pulses to see if we can get more cold water further down the reach to help bull trout. And so we're still doing a lot of data collection on that. But that is, the rehabilitation question is one that's still out there as well. We certainly have to balance restoration of wilderness character with our other needs. And then we have to figure out what to do with those water rights so that they are able to hopefully stay in stream or in our community rather than getting transferred down to Thompson Falls or something like that further down the Clark Fork. So there's a lot to do. And we've been talking about what to do with our partners for 3 or 4 years very intensively. And so we really thought the first thing to do would be, let's just tackle one of the dams. Let's figure out how to do it, the permitting required, the process behind it, the logistics of doing it. And so the low-hanging fruit was really McKinley Lake. And some of the reasons that it made sense is it was an easement dam. We have broad legal rights to go up there and do work rather than a special use permit through the Forest Service. There was significant seepage coming through the dam. It's a really small water right, so if we lose it, it's not really going to matter that much in the whole scheme of things. It's also really had some non-native rainbows in it, but we've not been able to document any fish here recently. It also had this huge erosion scar, and so this is not natural. This is an erosion scar from the spillway, and so this is like 200 foot of elevation and thousands of feet, and this is probably a 50 foot deep to plus trench. And so water that is, as spillways get blocked and released, and then this head cut is basically forming. And since I've been working on the project, it's marched back about, I think, 8 feet. But it will eventually breach the lake. And when that happens, you're going to have a lot more resource damage than if you did it naturally, or did it in a controlled manner. So this one really was the one that the Forest Service wanted to see us fix. We had a lot more rights to work with it, and it really lent itself to a good pilot project. And so McKinley Lake is, again, just under 7,000 feet. It's a relatively decent sized dam compared to the other ones. It's 15 feet high. The lake in general has a max depth of 28 feet, and that is in addition to the 15-foot dam height. So the natural lake was probably in that 15 to 18 feet deep max, and so it wasn't a really deep lake when it was impounded. It's got a pretty small water right. And you can see really easily here, that is the old lake line right here. And then, this is the fluctuation zone that this lake fluctuates every year as it fills and drains. Oh, I did have this in here. Great. So we got the original drawings from McKinley. We got all the original drawings for all of these. The other cool thing about McKinley is we believe that it's one of the last ones they built, and we feel it's a full earthen core, which makes it a lot easier to remove. There's not huge rock and stuff in there. There's not a timber cribbing, which is also more complicated. This was built as one of the last ones in the late 20s. 8 men, 2 teams, 1 horsepacker, 4 weeks. They had to clear almost 7 acres of timber around the lake, float those logs in, mill them, build the dam, and then we've got all the details because they kept really good rates or notes on how this was built, all the way down to even the wage scale. And yeah, I was a little bit wrong, but it was $5 a day, pretty lucrative in the 20s, and you only got $1 extra if you had a pack horse. But if you had a team, you got more than 1 horse, then you got $2 a day. And this is what it looks like. In general, if you're walking up to the lake, there's a great little campsite, and this is the trail that leads out on the top of the dam. The dam actually takes like a 90-degree right there and then runs. You can see the floodplain that fills and drains. You can see all the logs and the stumps from where this area was clear cut. You can see that this area is trying to regrow plants, but it gets seasonally flooded and is underwater for months on end. And so it's really just wetland obligate plants and just a few of them. It's a hand-stacked rock dam, which is not unique. This is every one of these dams is like that. And what was really interesting, I think you can see it, and you can kind of see it here. Every one of these dams is similar in that there's a big borrow pit area. And so this whole hillside right here, it just has all these stunted trees, and you can tell they just scraped it down and borrowed all their material as close as they could to where they were building the dam. And so here's the valve, the old valve box. It's permanently open. This thing does fill. It's full right now, I guarantee it. But it takes all the way until, I think this photo was first week of August, to get all the way down to natural lake level. And so this pipe that's coming out of it is, I think, an 8-inch pipe. It's not big, and that just takes a long time to drain that lake. From 2019 to 2023, we did a lot of stuff up there to get ready for this. And we are now at a point where we are fully approved to do this work, and hope to actually pull it off this summer. We had to do a bunch of as-built, a bunch of research. We had to take get a lot of data from the site. We had all this coordination meetings with the Forest Service. This is a historical resource, so we had to actually document that entirely and come up with a plan with the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure that we can still interpret that on site. We have completed all the engineering. We did vegetation sampling. We did fisheries and reptile and amphibian monitoring. We did a bunch of inundation studies. We actually went up there and dug test pits on top of the dam. And I should have included that photo too. If you guys know Rob Roberts, he's got long arms. And so literally like holding him by his ankles to try to get as far down. Like we had to 6 foot straight down into the dam to make sure there was not a log cribbing structure in there. So we knew what we were dealing with when we started to tear this apart. We completed environmental assessments and minimum requirements analysis framework. You're going to see those acronyms throughout this next few slides. The Wilderness MRAF is really just that framework, that decision-making framework that you put together to make sure you're really being considerate to that wilderness character and using the minimum tools required to actually do the job. We also did a case study review. One of the big questions, and I'll have a slide in here, was what will happen when we drain this down? There was a lot of discussion early on of like, well, you're going to have to restore the entire bathtub ring around the entire lake. And that is a lot of work compared to just breaching the dam and restoring just the outlet. And so we went up and did some case studies on other lakes that have been functionally breached. This is really came out, this is kind of one of our very early designs, but it generally fits with the plan. And so the idea is to make a trapezoidal breach right here where the outlet pipe is and move that material around. We are not going to be doing as much fill as you see before. This is that area that was scraped. I was telling you, you can see there's just these stunted trees where they've just pulled all that material down to build this dam. And so in general, this breach would be, I think, about 70 feet on the bottom. I've got the numbers in here, and over twice that along the top. And then rebuild the creek as it leaves the lake. So to do this, there's some complications. One of the biggest complications is weather. You get up there and you go up there in June, you could still get snowstorm. You're going to have a completely full pool lake. You're going to have so many mosquitoes you cannot even open your eyes. This is the buggiest place I've ever been in the Missoula Valley. But it has a really short season. By October, you're getting snows and roads are closing down, and you got to have your project done, and you got to have the outlet of that lake be ready to handle a 500-year flood event. And so it's a very short work window that really is August to October. Before you can even start taking the dam apart, you got to drain the lake. And so got to dewater the dam. We've got to remove boulders and salvage them off the face so that we can re-armor our breach and rebuild our creek. We've got to salvage a bunch of plants and topsoil. We got to remove about 500 cubic yards of fill, and fill those depressions. We've got pipe and cribbing that all has to come out. We've got to rebuild that stream channel going out, and then establish that breach and armor it so that it can withstand everything that would be thrown at it. Our construction methods, as we started to, were really dictated by our work with the Forest Service and the requirements that they had. And so going through both, and because the dams are actually regulated by the state, but the dams are on federal property and they're owned by a city. There's a little bit of this that had to get figured out. So we did, went through a federal NEPA process. We went through a state NEPA process. We did an EA, and we did that wilderness MRAF. We really had to analyze those effects to wilderness character. I think this is a real difference between what a public entity managing these lakes and a private entity managing these lakes is. There's arguably every legal right for us to just go up there and do this work. But we have to recognize that this community is who founded the Rattlesnake Wilderness and cares about this area. And so making sure that we are also being true to everything that is valuable to the community up there. Certainly look at those impact to natural resources, and not just the dam work itself, but we are, just like when they built it, going to have a crew of people living up there for months at a time. And so what impacts are those people going to have, not just our construction impacts? Cost effectiveness, safety and access is huge, and I already mentioned timing and duration. So some of the things, sorry, this is a horrible map, but this just gives you an idea of kind of what we're dealing with. This is McKinley Lake. This is where the project would be. This is trail all the way to this point. This is almost unpassable road. You can get to about this point. This is wilderness here. This is they call the cherry stem up the main trailhead. The first place that you could actually offload horses, if you wanted to use horses or hold horses, is 8 miles, 9 miles, no, I think it's 9 miles away from the site. And then at the end of the wilderness boundary is another parking area. So most of your commute would be from this location, hiking straight uphill 5 miles to get to your work site. Our initial construction methods, and so this is what we really started with, and this is when we did our NEPA. Document was flying equipment in pieces, putting it back together, tearing out the dam, and leaving. Hand labor methods, doing it totally traditional, the way it was done when the dams were built. heavy lift helicopters, so looking at using just bigger helicopters to bring stuff in, modern and blasting, so a mix of equipment and explosives, and then hand labor and blasting. And one of the things that you'll notice here, and I think, and you know, in general, as we looked at all this, the option that was recommended by our engineers that we had working on this was alternative number 4, which was modern and blasting. And one of the reasons was it was going to be the safest, it was going to be the quickest, the fact that we could get it done with less people in 49 days versus 147 days by traditional means meant that we could get it done quickly. We had buffer on either side if we had bad weather or other things that came up. And we weren't going to have to do it over 2 seasons and stabilize the site and come back the next year. And so that was the recommendation from our engineering team. We then took those and ran it through our MRAF, through the Forest Service, and really tried to finalize. And we got it down to 3 techniques. Traditional methods, and we were able to really tighten that up working with Forest Service. And at this point, as we started to move through this, and I would call the Forest Service like strong partners at this point, we are looking at using the 9-mile pack string to get materials up and back. We're looking at using a blaster out of Idaho that works for the Forest Service to blow the thing up. And so we will have Forest Service folks helping us with this. But these are the 3 methods that we really looked at. Full traditional, and not full traditional. The one thing that we have, and when I say traditional, means it meets the Wilderness Act. You're not allowed to have a wheelbarrow in the wilderness because it's a mecca. So this is not full traditional. We were going to use a wheelbarrow because they're really handy. Traditionals with minimized motorized equipment. So one of the things is putting in those 6-inch siphon pipes. So we got to take in hundreds of feet of PVC pipe and set up 4 huge siphons and get them going a month and a half before we're going to do our work to drain that lake so it's ready for us. And so getting that pump going, motorized auger to put in to bore in and do the explosives. And then the other one would be just primary. This is closest to that very first option, which was just go up, fly in equipment, and do the work. So the big question, and to let you know, we really landed on alternative 2. This is the one that's been approved that we're looking at moving forward with in 2024. The big question was restoration. What's going to happen? This is what we're looking at here. And there's acres and acres and acres of land in the bathtub ring around the lake. And so we did a couple years of just going and studying Glacier Lake, which drains really quick. It's a very small watershed. It just has like literally one slope of a mountain that drains into it. And it's been permanently drawn down. And you can see that was drawn down in '96. And that it's already got trees growing around. And some of them, there's white bark pine in there. And so what we've been able to show is that there's such seed rain coming into this area. And we've basically got no noxious weeds up there. We've been doing 9 years of noxious weed treatment. That we once you get this lake back to its original level, this site's going to be within a few years growing trees like no tomorrow. What we are planning on doing is going up there in fall of 24 or summer of 24, flying in our siphon pipe, getting our siphon going, starting to draw down the lake in June. Coming in with a crew of Montana Conservation Corps folks for a couple weeks to do all the boulder removing and get the site prepped, drill holes. Mules will come in with explosives in our explosives team, pack the dam, blow this up. One of the things that we've learned through this, and we didn't even think about blowing it up, was once we started really working with the Forest Service, they were like, have you ever thought about just blowing it up? You know, like explosives is an approved tool in the wilderness. And we're like, well, who would do that? And they're like, well, we could probably do it. And I'm like, well, you're going to own the dam when we're done with it. So how about you blow it up? And long story short, we're going to blow it up. And so it will be dry at the time when the explosives go off. And then there is going to be putting things back together. We still have to make sure we've got sustainable slopes on that breach. and rebuild, it's a couple hundred feet of stream, because that stream channel is going to run from right here to right about there. And so there will be a significant amount of just putting things back together. So we're also looking at, again, just site maintenance and transitioning this dam from city ownership to Forest Service ownership. We will have a couple years of obligation to make sure the site's stable, but in general, our goal is within a few years, there will be no need to ever visit this site with motorized equipment ever again. And it will just be a historic remnant of a dam in the Rattlesnake Wilderness that people can hike to and check out. Last slide here. Next steps, we just finished our 30-day objection period to the Lolo National Forest decision notice on our methods on that alternative number 2, saying that's what we were going to do. During that 30-day objection period, we received one written objection from one individual, and so feel pretty confident that our plan is supported, and we're moving forward, and that decision notice has now been signed as of literally, I think, like a week ago. We are working on this agreement to basically, one of the things, and again, this is just, I've worked enough in bureaucracy, it's funny, like at some point the Forest Service was like, well, we should probably get an agreement in place to allow federal staff to blow up city infrastructure, and we're like, okay. And so we've got to create this document. We are going to have, we're finalizing the access plan. We've got a helicopter reserved. We're flying. The only helicopter use will be one day at the beginning of the project to bring materials, camp supplies, and the siphon in, and one day at the end of the project to demobilize and bring things out. The other motorized equipment that we will have on site would be a motorized pump to get the siphon going, and to have in case there's some huge rain event in the middle of the project where we have to get that siphon going again to protect the creek. And then a power auger to get all those holes in to pack the explosives. And other than that, everything will be hand power and horsepower. We're looking at beginning the lake drawdown in July, blowing it up in August, restoring the creek and stabilizing the site in 2024, and then demobilizing and getting out of there. So with that, if you're interested and want to keep tracking the project, we have been doing updates. There's a lot of those documents I mentioned on Engage Missoula Rattlesnake Wilderness Dams. Our current DEA is posted at the DNIC, and then it's also at the Forest Service. That MRAP document and everything else I talked about is also at Forest Service. And no, man, yeah, with that, I'd take any questions. I'm going to go back to this picture because I just think it's a better one to end on. Not bad. Yeah, thanks.
How does the potentially relinquishing water rights work? Like, I know that lake is a small one without water,
right.
But by nature of just taking out that dam, do we automatically relinquish those water rights as the city ownership?
Potentially. And some would argue, and so one of the things that's been fascinating about this is we've not been able to find any other project like this anywhere in the US where you've got, a city owning this level of infrastructure in a wilderness with our rights described in the Wilderness Act, and it is rare. And so a lot of this has been, and the delay to this point has been like, we don't even know the process to be able to move this through. Some of the federal hoops that we had to move it through, plus our own processes. And the water rights thing, one of the things that we are looking at doing, and some would argue that when we took that lower intake dam, the ability to actually capture that water, we were kind of setting a clock on those water rights. Trying to transfer them to either groundwater rights, and we do know that our groundwater and Rattlesnake Creek are very tied together, or transferring them to in-stream flow would be another one. And so those are the two avenues that they're mainly looking at for these by the city. Yeah.
So that's a consideration for all, like any other.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
But you're going kind of removing it without knowing what the
We've got 10 of these things. And so like at a point we're kind of like, okay, we need to just start picking away at them. And this was such a small one that it was just like, okay, I think we're going to have it figured out by the time it happens. We've got a lot of folks working on it and they're making good progress. And so, yeah. Yeah.
Are you worried about litigation from lawyers having to see yours like first watch?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think that, one of the things that is unique, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've sat in a room with a lot of lawyers on this project here recently, is that the fact that the rights to access the site and maintain and manage these dams is actually written into the Wilderness Act. It really was about making sure we're following the right process. And what was tricky about this project is there wasn't a clear process, and so we just decided to follow them all. We hope, and I think this is another one, and we've been working. We've had multiple meetings with Wilderness Watch specifically, and I think it is definitely, we are all in total agreement that decommissioning this dam and getting it out of the, I mean, this could be, as you start to roll out these dams, the biggest thing we've done to protect wilderness character since the designation of the wilderness area. Like, it is giving up our rights to use motorized access up there. So everybody agrees, take them out. It's the tools and the methods. And so, and we've not always had full agreement on it. And, there were a lot of complications with that traditional means, like, going through that exercise. It was a very useful exercise. It was a requirement that the Forest Service put on us. It was one we were intending to do anyway, but it just going through what it would take to do it all by hand really strengthened and informed our preferred alternative. Like, we adopted so many more of those traditional means into our preferred alternative. And I mean, we entered this thing really thinking like, we're just going to fly a mini excavator up there and do this in like a few weeks. Like, it's not a big project. We've spent more money on just getting to this point than we ever will on pulling the dam and restoring the site. And so going through that process and having that discussions, I think, have really strengthened it and made it much stronger. And I'm hoping that protects us. Yeah.
Is there talk about removing the non-native fish?
There has not been. One of the things with a drawdown, this is, I think, what happened at McKinley, and it's a pretty shallow lake, and I think Warden would be the same. Warden is permanently full, like the valve is broken. Once that lake starts to fluctuate, the fish are just getting killed off due to lack of oxygen. Like, the lake, it freezes so solid for so long up there that some of these populations, we think once you remove the dam, the fish just won't be there anymore. And that we've seen that on McKinley, we've seen it on Glacier. And so we have no intent to change that. And I think some of the lakes, and this is another thing that we've been looking at, is like Big and Sanders. Those are the two biggest ones. They're also the two biggest recreational destinations. They've got the best fisheries, they got the best camping areas, they've got and so, recognizing that there are other values up there that we need to also consider and protect. And so, yeah, we've not talked about that at all. It's crazy. If you're ever up there running around, you're at the base of Mosquito Peak, which is aptly named. This whole area is just bog after bog after wetland after wetland. You go out there with a flashlight at night, you're going to see the most amphibians you've ever seen in your life. And so a lot of these, and we've started to see it just in the course of McKinley, like we never saw a long-toed salamander or Columbus spotted frog in the lake on any of our trips until we started to realize there was no fish there. And so like the top predator in these areas were probably salamanders, and they were definitely there and are going to recolonize. And so, but yeah, we've not really been, there's no real consideration to talk about fish. These fish are also totally isolated. There's natural barriers, like fish never could get up there because of waterfalls and stuff. And so, yeah. I saw your hand up as well.
I saw an article in the paper today about the comment period on the forest
Oh,
future. I just wondered if that's going to include
Oh, I didn't read that. Was that about they're doing all the land use planning right now and their forest plan revisions?
Period that, they just ratified stuff, like it's
You, I think that is all their land use designations and their forest plan revisions, which is a huge, colossal effort. It will certainly inform this. It's not going to fundamentally impact a lot of it because the system itself and the easements and the special use permits. I mean, they predate the wilderness. The easements predate the Forest Service even owning any of the land around it, and so you kind of have they're just kind of written in, and it'll be a copy and paste thing, I'm sure, with the new forest plan revisions for these lakes. Yes, well, you totally should, and it is one that those documents do, and you go back and look at the one that was done. I think it was 1990 was the last time it was done, and it totally, like your experience that you get at the Rattlesnake Main Trailhead and moving through those lands was defined by that effort back in the late 80s, early 90s, and this is our opportunity as a community to define like what the next 20, 30 years will look like. So definitely worth staying. And you can find it on that other website. So. Yeah.
I had a handful of questions that
sure
arose as you were going through your presentation. I realize this first one's a little bit more aquifer, like a question about the aquifer than the creek. But
yeah.
So when they switched the source of the drinking water from the creek to the aquifer, I would assume they preemptively built the infrastructure for the sourcing the water from the aquifer before they made the switch and like.
I think they were already doing it. These lakes and that system, like a 3 million gallon reservoir. I don't know how much we're drinking a day, but like in the 80s, it would not have really. It was probably only covering a very small portion of the community. And the way that 30-inch wooden main ran from the lower intake dam, 4 miles to Waterworks Hill, that geodesic dome that you see on top of Waterworks Hill, and then went out from there. And so really it was just like 3 to 4 miles of, and it was still feeding even the lower Rattlesnake from that Waterworks Hill site where that dome is, kind of by the peace sign when you look north of town.
Doesn't the topography kind of like go up towards the hill, right? So how would they get the water from the creek to the hill to pump it into town?
It's that geodesic dome is at a lower elevation than the dam, the lower intake dam, and so it was just all downhill. But that wooden pipe, you still every few years will have a portion but the trail behind the Pease farm, that whole area that was clear cut for the old Duncan Road, and that wooden water main is underneath that lower trail, and every once in a while a portion of the trail will collapse, and you'll see like wooden pipes down there. And so it's still in the ground, and we salvaged a bunch of it from the dam site. It's super cool. It's all like old growth redwood, super amazing stuff.
You had mentioned that I don't know if it was Travel Limited or one of the collaborative agencies on this project. Do you know how they were able to quantify, like figure out that all the water holding in that wetland exceeds what was in the reservoir?
Yeah, and so and I don't, but I do know, and if you guys want to reach out, like Paul Parson, I know you work with him a lot, like he has all the data that they did up in the 9 mile, because they've reconstructed like 6-7 miles of that creek. It was all old placer mining, and did a huge study up there on like the water that was getting stored in those wetlands. What we did on the dam site is that same person who was a graduate student at the time and then employed by TU, and I don't think she's there anymore, literally just did a back of the napkin kind of thing for us. And she was like, yeah, I mean, you're probably storing about the same amount as that reservoir was. And it's being released later in the summer. Just knowing the way, what's cool about that site, I don't have pictures of it, but where the reservoir was is just below it is this Montana friggin' jungle. This whole area is it is just wet year round. And we did some soil pits down there, and you go about a foot of humus, and then you get to a foot thick of just gray clay, which is just the bottom glacial Lake Missoula. and all a jumbo and everything just kind of seeps out into this area. And so that water that filled those wetlands was not creek water. It was coming out of this hillside into this area. And so it's really fascinating. But when they built this, they removed that clay lens, and so it wasn't there when we were doing our work. But
I worked with Paul and Rob this summer. I didn't know this. I wish I had known. I would have asked them. Just a few more questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's up to these guys.
Yeah. Has anyone for the city quantified how much money the city is going to save over time with the removal of these dams, as opposed because they're paying?
No, not really. We're just trying to figure out how to fund the projects at this point. But it really flying a crew up there and treating weeds or hiking up and treating weeds, doing your initial flight. I would imagine we're probably spending, I would say, maybe $20K a year. But we're not improving anything. We're doing base level maintenance. If one of these fails, we are going to have to go up and pick up the pieces. And so the needs to actually keep the dams intact and keep them from falling apart far exceed what we're paying annually.
Okay. So for the dam where they just stack a bunch of rocks on top of each other, what was used to seal the gaps in between?
Nothing.
Rock? Nothing.
No.
It
is, yeah, and most of them are timber cribs. And I think I might have a picture of Big Lake, because that is most of them are timber cribs. And so you'd build this timber crib. It's really hard. Yeah, you can see it. So this is Big Lake, the lake number 3. And this is the trapezoid, and it's just a massive amount of earth. And this one they did build a timber cribbing structure to hold that dirt. And then the dirt itself is just faced with dry stacked, hand stacked rock to just keep it from eroding. But you've just got a plug of soil that is keeping that water.
And then last question, sir.
Yeah.
Based on who is responsible for the restoration of these sites, ecologically, let's say, after the project is done, right? So
the city.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we need to replace our divots. We need to make sure that the site is on a trajectory. It's not going to be fully restored when we hand it off to the Forest Service, but yeah, we are required to make sure that it's meets their requirements for restoration. Yeah.
How do you expect to see issue flows and temperature affected in Rattlesnake? Are you expecting to see any difference, or is it going to stay about?
Not with McKinley. I would say this is really just a trickle that's coming in. We have done some temperature gauge monitoring, and even on Big Lake, which has got the easiest to use valve, and so we've been doing these releases. We have found, and it's really, really complex science, but 9.5 turns on the valve opens at about halfway, and at halfway you get 50-degree water coming out in August. If you fully open it, what's funny is that pipe is really only going to the natural lake line, and it starts to pull a vortex and pull hot water off the top of the lake. And so the water actually as it's coming out the pipe is hotter than if you only had it half cracked. And so, we found the sweet spot last year with the flows, and then we had some temp gauges. And unfortunately, that temperature that we have right now really, it's only a few hundred feet, and it starts to just equalize. The bull trout, which is where we really want that cold pulse, is probably 2 miles down the creek. One of the things we've talked about is if you really wanted to put cold water into the creek late season, you'd want that pipe that's sucking the water not to be just 15 feet underwater. You'd want to run it down into the lake's 200 feet deep. There's cold water down there. And so, again, yeah, what we're seeing is quantity, not that real temperature benefits. Sorry, yeah.
What I see from your presentation is so much rigorous consideration for this specific site, and I'm wondering if you expect with each of these dam sites to have to go through like such a level of rigorous research and process, or if you see kind of escalating and becoming more streamlined,
right?
Or because they're so unique, each site's so unique.
Yes, I think no, I don't think we'd ever complete this project if we follow the same timeline on this first one. And I would love to do at least 2 of these in my career. What I think we're doing, and it really was, and what we realized, and there was a big question at the beginning, was like, if we're going to go through all this, let's just do all the dams we want to remove in one big process, one big NEPA, one big MEPA. That was going to be an incredibly expensive endeavor. And we also did not really know what permitting, like what was going to be required. So now that we know the roadmap, our intent is to actually finish this and then look at like all the other low-hanging fruits. Once we figure out the water right stuff, all the other like ones that are just like, obviously they just need to go, roll them all into one process, do them all at once, and have them pretty much shovel ready. So all we got to do is just activate funding and go in and do it. Tracking the actual costs of this is going to be really important as well when we start doing this work. Literally like ballpark to do what we're talking about with a good partnership with nonprofits and the Forest Service and using Forest Service blasters and mule trains and stuff. I think I'd be surprised if we spend more than $150,000, $200,000, which is not much at all in the whole scheme of things. If we get through that process and get approval, I think being able to just tick off dams. The other great thing is, and we found this on the lower intake dam, if you say, hey, I got a shovel-ready project to remove a dam, it starts to rain money. Like people want to fund dam removal. Like the majority of the money that came for the removal of the lower intake dam, a big chunk came from FEMA, but the majority of private dollars actually came from nonprofits that weren't even out of California and other areas that were just wanted to fund dam removal projects. Yeah, the hope is to roll them all up in one.
I got 2 questions for you.
Hit me.
Thank you. This is a great, wonderful, comprehensive presentation.
Thanks.
Are there opportunities for citizen science to get any data for you?
Yeah. I do think, and one of the things that we have been talking about is, really being a little bit more open when we do releases, like when we know we're sending a pulse of water down the creek, just to actually collect. I mean, right now we just get data from the stream gauge, but actually having more data collection through the reach. Especially if we're able to start, some of the things we've been talking about, the golden goose would be to actually get the valve in Sanders Lake functioning. There's 2 dams there and one's frozen solid. We were able to crack it open so that the water's lower. And so we're looking at trying to get that valve functioning so that we can actually do 2 releases and do bigger pulses and really look at temperature. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. The other thing that I think that we've recognized is there is a just tremendous amount of historical resources up here, and the amount of time, literally just going around and documenting, these are the dams, this is what they look like, this is every one of them. If you walk around, you'll find the old log deck skid yard where they used to pull logs in, and documenting those things on site is stuff that still needs to be done for all those other ones, because those are also requirements that we have to do right by the cultural resources up there. Certainly, as the project goes on, I think there are opportunities to do volunteer work. The thing that gets really tough is that, unlike the lower intake dam, where we can say, hey guys, next weekend, many people can show up, we can do it. We can't have more than 10 people on site because it's a wilderness area, and we don't, we have to keep the crew size small. And so I do think if we end up leveraging volunteers, it would probably be later in the project as we get into demobilization. Okay, we just need a bunch of people to help us pack stuff out or get stuff in or stuff like that. So yeah, it's the accessibility and the size limit makes it really tough. So data collection though, there's tons of data collection up there. So, you know, just documenting some of the things we've been talked about, like the fisheries and the aquatic life and the, yeah.
Touched on my second question, is the cultural review of indigenous aspects of the.
Yeah. Yes and no. And I mean, we consulted with the tribe quite a bit on the lower intake dam, and they were, I mean, they recognized, you know, as you all probably know, Rattlesnake Creek was a major food source and fishery for the Salish peoples. Like that was, there's a fishing camp at the confluence of Rattlesnake and Clark Fork every year for thousands of years to harvest bull trout to get through the winter. And that dam and, you know, populating Missoula Valley really put the end to that run. And so they're incredibly supportive of that lower intake dam removal. That's also kind of generally where one of the People's Trail comes through and goes over the saddle. We've not really found much evidence of, you know, tribal use in these areas. One of the things that has struck me though, working with the tribe, and this just like really pulled on my ecologist heartstrings, and it's really important for everybody that works in natural resources to recognize, is that natural resources are cultural resources. They're cultural resources for our tribes. They're cultural resources for the people that are here today. And so just working with, you know, that perspective really starts to blend your work and recognize like we are hitting every target with this. And so, yeah, we've not been able to really uncover like much direct information from the site, but tribe's very supportive of the work.
So with the shift from having the dams and the surface water as the emergency supply, like, is there a different emergency supply, or is there just not a need for one now since there's so many wells all over the place?
I do not, yeah, and I would be the one to ask. I don't know of another emergency supply, so I mean, keep your rain barrels. But I think one thing, well, one thing, yeah, one thing that we do know, and you know, as we've done more monitoring and as we've tracked these wells since we've been punching holes in the ground, is we're blessed by a really great aquifer here that replenishes really quickly. And granted, I will say every time I hear someone say, "Oh, we got this endless aquifer," I'm like, "Oh, that sounds like an advertisement in a rail car in 1890." Like, "Oh, endless resource, we'll never deplete it." And so I'm always a proponent of water conservation. But yeah, there's I'm not sure what that would be. Bucket Brigade to the Clark Fork or something like that. Yeah. Sure. You know, I've got to check in with Lad on that. It's been a while since we've talked, and I mean, I can only assume that they have. I've snorkeled around in some of those pools up there, and I've definitely seen a lot of fish. I do know that like making sure that that site restoration was done and done to completion before we really started looking at changing. The state really wanted to make sure that the site was stable before they started to address fishing regulations. The other big project that we're hoping to pull off actually in the next year or so is, you know, part of the whole rec plan for the lower intake dam. We are looking at, there is a plan to build, we've got an easement from Northwestern Energy to build a parking lot at the end of Duncan Drive on Northwestern Energy property and formalize a loop trail. It'd be like a mile-long loop that gets you up to the dam site, and we'll have an interpretive kiosk there. And that's kind of the final piece of that larger dam project. And so that is something we hope to kind of pull off in the next 12 to 18 months. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We got really good schools, but it seems like there's a lot of illiterate people. They just don't read the signs.
With the plan for the dam removal, that the alternative that was selected, I thought in the sort of, there was that special provision of the wilderness that,
Yeah.
That allowed motorized use for
Right.
maintenance. Did that not apply
To what?
to the dam removal?
Oh, it totally does. Yeah. Yeah, and I think especially this being an easement dam, we felt pretty confident and actually on legal review that we could do this work without going through really any of the permitting or plan. This is again, and I think, you know, when we approach our work, we've recognized that we're stronger as partners, and we've got a multi-decadal project here, and so wanted to make sure we're doing right by everything, all the resources, and doing it right the first time on this pilot project. We might not necessarily need to do all. I guarantee you, we won't need to do every step as we look at the other dams, but this first one, we really wanted to make sure we fleshed it all out. And the other thing was just having that dialogue and back and forth and multiple opportunities to talk about methods and what was palatable and what wasn't palatable. Was important. And I mean, I think that's the other side of the coin here. And we think a lot about like requirements that the state or the feds put on a project like this. But like, I work for the city, and you know, city council could decide, or the mayor could decide not to do something like this. And so making sure you're building a project that can go for multiple decades to get to good end goals that everybody supports is in my experience really critical to, you know, implement at this very first one, you know.
Are you going to be recording these?
Yes. Yeah. We are looking at having some time-lapse photography up there. Trust me, I feel like we should sell those 10 tickets for the people that can be on site. We could probably fund the project, just like the plunger. Yeah, you know, and it will be, I think one of the great things about it, and like, it's been really just so much fun working with folks at the Forest Service as we've gotten to this point where they're like, wow, this is possible. We're going to be able to do this. Like, suddenly it's like, mule packers are coming out of the woodwork, like they can't, you know, and a lot of people, we're bringing over, and they're called this a master blaster from Idaho Falls, who does a ton of this work, because we don't have that experience in our valley, but we have out at the fire lab, they teach blasting skills. And so this is going to be, you know, a professional coming from Idaho to teach our local guys how to do this type of work. And so, I mean, we'll have to, I mean, you got to get folks. We're going to close down trails coming in from every location, and I mean, there'll be more than 10 people just because we have to have a safe work site. But
that part's crying for
yeah, totally. Just stand on this trail. Don't let anyone in. Yeah.
Live stream the actual.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's no internet access. Although I will say, yeah. We don't have that in the budget. That ridge right there, you get up to that ridge, which is it's 4G at the top of that ridge, and so because you're just overlooking, it's a you know, you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, and then you hike to the top of that ridge, and you're looking at Snowbolt, Grand Creek Basin, and the entire Missoula Valley, and so you're like, wow, this is like a really urban wilderness experience I'm having here as your phone's blowing up in your pocket, you know. So
we want to say thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys.